middle stretch was in the current Ohio River Valley, then headed up to Chillicothe, Ohio, and the Taze Valley disappears in the surface there, and then it goes subsurface, and you can trace across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and it attached to what's now the Mississippi through the Illinois River. So if that geography doesn't mean anything to you, that's okay, because it doesn't really directly relate to what's here, but it just shows you that there was a large segment of the Ohio that wasn't draining down the current path of the Ohio. A smaller section of the Ohio drained north. That's the upper Ohio. Upstream from what's marked here, I think New Martinsburg. Basically, yeah, New Martinsville, sorry. The Ohio from here upstream. Today, this is a narrow valley, narrow part of the Ohio River Valley. If you drive through it, it's interesting. If you look at the route of the tributaries, from New Martinsville south, they're aligned concordant. They're pointing in the direction of modern-day flow in the Ohio. If you look at the tributaries upstream from there, they're pointing as if the river wants to flow north. So the angles are wrong until you get right down within a few hundred feet of the modern-day river level, and at that point they do almost a right-angle bend to meet properly with the acute angle pointing, in the acute angle upstream, essentially pointing in the direction of modern-day flow. So that if you look at the valleys, they're aligned with northward drainage in that part of the Ohio. And that's sometimes been referred to as the Steubenville River, which drained north, and I'm going to borrow this one more time, into an area somewhere around East Liverpool and Beaver, PA. You see Elwood City up there. Basically, that river system probably drained up the Little Beaver Creek, and into the Beaver. And from where did it go from there? I mean, it's going up the modern-day Beaver Valley. All right, and then it headed off into Ohio and the I guess Youngstown area, and probably from there headed not into the Ohio, not into the Mississippi, but northward into what has been called the Irrigan River, i.e. the ancestral river that is now occupied by Lake Erie. And through that basin, through the shales that are there to kind of define where the lake is at, and then out to St. Lawrence. So this was north-flowing drainage. And it probably was there for tens of millions of years. Hard to say. It's all an erosional landscape. You don't have real good evidence left of that whole drainage network. Well, there's a problem. Frank, what's the problem? Where's Visalia? What's the problem with that north-flowing river? Yeah, all right, the Pleistocene arrives possibly even earlier than the Pleistocene. Great white masses come down from the north. That northward flowing route through certainly the area around Quebec, that's not tenable pretty early on. And then later, you can't even get into what's now Lake Erie because of the ice that's there. So that is an absolutely untenable situation. So the first thing that would have happened as these great white masses come down from the north is that whole drainage system would block up and would form a lake. And that is at least idealized in what's shown on this handout here and also in the guidebook. This big lake. What was the lake like? Well, you can see there are a lot of estuaries, a lot of, not particularly wide bodies. It's not like a great lake. Often these rivers are referred to as river lakes because it probably, in certain times, especially when there's spring melt runoff, and maybe during very heavy rainfall events, there would be substantial flow through that lake. So it's not a perfectly standing body of water. Okay, so that happened. At some point, the water level rose up to a drainage divide. Israel Charles White, the founder of our geology department at WVU, and also a pioneer of geology in this part of Pennsylvania, I.C. White proposed two possible outlets. One of which is at New Martinsville, which for some reason that drainage took to, and another one near Salem, West Virginia, down at this very southern limit. You can see it traced on the handout, that the river did not occupy. The elevation of that Salem outlet is right around 1,100 feet above sea level. And from the elevation of that outlet, I.C. White proposed a lake at 1,100 feet in this basin. And what you see of the reconstructions of Lake Manongahela are by and large tracing the 1,100-foot contour line. All right, Frank, what's the problem with that? Salem, all right, do you see the little drainage, what? Yeah, right, yes, excuse me, I'll finish that off. The drainage at Salem, which today, well, it's now a rail trail. You go to that actual drainage divide, you don't see a lot because it was a railroad grade, railroad grade through there. It went from Fairmont to Parkersburg. Alrighty, it's kind of hard to see much there. There certainly is a very different profile. If you go up the headwaters of West Fork, which is at Salem, that's on the Mon side, it's a very low gradient stream. Get to the Middle Island Creek on the other side, it just drops off about 5 times steeper. And there certainly is piracy there. There certainly is several square miles of drainage that have been diverted from flowing east into now flowing to the west. So something has happened. There's certain, and if you follow the drainage divide between the Mon River and the more direct flows, such as Fishing Creek and Middle Island Creek and the others that go more directly to the Ohio, that area along that drainage divide is the place where there's been the most piracy. So I think that is a reasonable line of evidence that was probably topped over, but I have spent hours and hours there trying to look for routed river rocks or something else to show you that it's been occupied by through flowing stream. I can't really show that evidence there. Okay, so 2 possible divides, maybe one lake, or maybe not. And I'll go ahead and just throw this out at you. And if we would go back to this handout, the lake terminates at the mapped ice margin. If you look at the ice margin up there, the Wisconsin and the last glaciation came within about 12 miles of that right angle bend on the Ohio River, where the Ohio River I'll do it for you folks to see if I can do it backwards. It's coming up like this. Am I doing it right? All right. It does a right angle bend and then does another right angle bend. The first right angle bend is in Pennsylvania. The second right angle bend is in Ohio and West Virginia. That right angle bend is perfectly parallel to the Illinoisan margin. It's perfectly parallel to the Wisconsin margin. And my hunch is that is a very old ice margin. That's an ice marginal channel. So if that was the case, then probably Lake Manongahela wasn't a lake. It was, well, Lake Manongahela, as named by I.C. White, was a lake on the east side of that map, and the drainage on the other side was something different. So it's possible, yeah, the Steubenville Lake, if you want to call it that. Now, because the Ohio River flows through that area, the lake sediments have a different distribution than on the Manongahela, which is a much lower gradient, lower energy stream. So what you see in terms of lake sediments on that Steubenville arm is up tributaries. It does not absolutely attest that, in fact, there was a lake in what's now the Ohio River. Those lakes along the sides, up the tributaries, may have not been dammed by the ice, but by the outwash that came down that divide. And it's very possible that New Martinsville divide was actually quite a bit lower than 1,100 feet. And in a body of water, and then the main body of Lake Manongahela on the Manongahela Basin and up a little bit of the Allegheny Basin, and the very headwaters, well, the very beginning of the Ohio River, not the headwaters, but around the point, first maybe 30, 40 miles, that might have been under Lake Manongahela. All right, so what was it like? It was not a really deep lake. Our elevations here, on the very back page, I have the old 1900 topo map, and it shows you a possible route of ancient Lake Manongahela. You see elevations for sediments. The old river, what you find is the old strath, you find the bedrock floor in this part of the world of that old river system is about 900 feet above sea level. Morgantown's about 905 feet. If you trace that strath, that bedrock terrace that's underneath the lake sediments, Pittsburgh, I think in the Oakland area, it's about 880. It's a very low gradient stream between Morgantown and Pittsburgh, which river miles is like 100 miles. It only drops 25 feet. Today's Mon River is about 4 times steeper than that. So what you have is a high-level river with a fairly low gradient using the upper limit that's ever been suggested by anybody for Lake Manongahela, 1,100 feet. The maximum depth would have been 200 feet. And it also had lots of tributaries feeding in. They were unglaciated. It's not your typical glacial lake by any stretch. And I have some sediments. We can look at that for a little bit. It's also very diverse in what sediments are there. And that's what the 2 middle pages are about. One of the things that struck me when I came to Morgantown, everybody's talking about Lake Manongahela, Lake Manongahela, Lake Manongahela, Lake Manongahela. How old is it? Well, it's either 20,000 years old or older than radiocarbon dating. And not long after it came to WVU, Rob Jacobson did a study where he realized some of it's paleomagnetically reversed, which means it's over 750,000 years old. It made me think that maybe it's not one thing. In Israel, Charles White, when he named it, recognized that. He picked out 3 different facies of sediments from Lake Manongahela. From that moment until my grad student, Scott Morgan, nobody else worried about the facies. They found these fine-grained sediments in Lake Manongahela. And they found fine-grained sediments with boreal forest fossils in them, spruce, fir, and cold-loving plants and the like. And then they found Lake Manongahela sediments with modern-day plants in them. How does that work? Was the climate just incredibly dynamic, or are we looking at multiple ages, or multiple climates? And ultimately, Rob Jacobson, in his PhD dissertation, which is up in the area of Fairmont and Morgantown and upper parts of Lake Manongahela, he decided there were at least 2 stratigraphic units and then a number of terraces lower that had often been mistakenly identified as Lake Manongahela sediments. He wasn't sure whether the second lake phase was reversed or normal. It was so weathered that he couldn't really sort it out. But at least the first phase is paleomagnetically reversed. There are a bunch of reports from a certain geological survey in Morgantown. Mitch is not here to throw stones. But there are a bunch of reports from the 60s, 70s, 80s where they give you, they reported 20,000, 22,000-year-old radiocarbon dates on these lake sediments. I don't think those were on the lake sediments at all. I think they were on fluvial deposits, beaver pond deposits that formed on this flat ground long after that lake was long gone. Okay, so we have this 200-foot deep, a maximum 200-foot deep lake. It fills with sediment, mostly fine-grained sediment, but particularly in the tributaries that are coming from the east off of Chestnut Ridge, Pottsville sandstones, Allegheny sandstones, much coarser, much sandier. The tributaries coming off the Dunkard from the west, very clayey. Lower gradient tributaries coming in, they didn't have as much energy, of course the source of sediment was different. So right off the bat we have 2 different facies, and White did recognize this. Sandy sediment coming from the east, clayey sediment, and then he also recognized that they're flat out fluvial sediments. Well, then I turned Scott loose on the problem. What else can you find? And he dug up some old work by Al Donaldson and identified deltaic sediments. Can you imagine Al Donaldson would find deltaic sediments? Those of you that know Al, he found them in the Paleozoic and he found it in the Pleistocene as well. Yeah, there are colluvial deposits, including subaqueous debris flows that Rob Jacobson recognized. Let's see, what have I forgotten on the bases chart? It's been a while since this. Yeah, sandy alluvium, silty alluvium, deltaic facies. Oh yes, colluvium. That was deposited. Yeah, that's our state. That's our state dirt. And of course, that's a facing. A lot of times it interfingers in with the finer grained sediments. So what's been called Lake Manongahela is a lot of different things, and probably a number of deposits that aren't really associated with that lake at all. So one of the things I first got interested in coming to WVU is Lake Manongahela. I really have only had one student work on it in almost over 28 years now. But if you ever follow up doing anything with Lake Manongahela, I think I would very strongly encourage you to get Scott's thesis, take a hard look at it, and think of facies first. Be a good stratigrapher before you are a geomorphologist. Because you can match up terrace surfaces. But if you don't know what's under those terraces, you really don't know what it is you're trying to correlate.